Hi everyone, thank you so much for connecting with me today. Hope you are having a good week. So we're in our summer song series and we're talking about different psalms, many of them that King David wrote. And last week you might remember that we talked about Psalm 31 and we talked about how David was extremely honest about how he was feeling in the middle of a particular crisis. And last week, I referred to Psalm 27 and something about obedience, and we're going to talk about. And so I thought that I actually wanted to unpack it a little bit more, Psalm 27 today. So so that's what we're going to do. Our psalm today is the 27th Psalm. David says in verse 1, "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Why should I be afraid? The Lord is my fortress." Talked about that last week. "The Lord is my fortress, protecting me from danger. So why should I tremble? When evil people come to devour me, when my enemies and foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though a mighty army surrounds me, my heart will not be afraid. Even if I am attacked, I will remain confident." You know, as always, it's really, really important for us to understand the context of the culture that David was writing in. So David wrote this psalm roughly 3,000 years ago, a really, really long time ago, 3,000 years ago, kind of around 1000 BC, right? Fun fact, roughly 200 or so years before the Odyssey was written, and not 200 to 300 years before Christopher Nolan's film, but before the original poem was written. Anyways, David wrote this psalm around 1000, a little bit later than 1000 BC. So roughly 3,000 years ago, right? And 3,000 years ago, the culture was extremely different, with uppercase letters, extremely. Back then, the culture was very much a warrior culture. And people were celebrated for how many people they killed. and it was a regular thing. In fact, in 2 Samuel, in the story of David and Bathsheba, it says, "In the spring, when the kings go out to war," you know, David stayed home and relaxed in Jerusalem, right? But that statement, "in the spring, when kings go out to war," it was very much a warrior culture. And so, you know, in the off season during the winter, the kings would be like, and each city had its own king. They were like city states. So it's like kind of the king of, you know, Stouffville. Let's say Mayor Lovett is, you know, talking with his people in the winter and the off season, and they're like, okay, once the spring comes, you know, who should we attack? Which you know, so we're like, Uxbridge, yeah, we never liked those guys in Uxbridge. Let's attack Uxbridge, and we can steal all their stuff. And Uxbridge is talking about who they're gonna like. It was just a normal thing for people to go to war and to kill each other. And like I said, people were celebrated for how many people they killed, right? And there was a song about David and Saul. David has killed his 10,000s, but Saul 1,000. I forget exactly. But Saul was like so upset because the children were celebrating that David killed more people than him, right? So the culture is extremely different, a warrior culture. You know, today we don't celebrate. Like you know, we don't go like, "Oh, that person's so awesome because they killed 500 people." You know, like that just would never happen, right? So today we're a little more sophisticated. We value peace. We value working things out, but not so in that day. So when David says in verse 1, "Lord is my light, my salvation." Well, in verse 2, when evil people come to devour me, when my enemies and foes attack me, they will stumble and fall. Though a mighty army surrounds me. David is not talking figuratively here. He's talking literally, that people are actually trying to kill him, right? And so in the middle of, you know, this, David says in verse 1, he makes this aspirational statement. The Lord is my light and my salvation, so why should I be afraid? The Lord is my fortress, protecting me from danger, so why should I tremble? Well, I can think of a few reasons why David should be afraid and tremble, because there are people conspiring to kill him, right? And that is a pretty good reason. But in the middle of this, can we call it turmoil, or in the middle of these threats, David has, it seems that he has a strength and a confidence in the middle of these threats. Now remember, last week we talked about how David was very, very honest about his feelings, right? In Psalm 31, he was extremely honest, more honest than I would be about my feelings. He's extremely honest about his feelings. So I don't think he is just sort of brushing aside and pretending his feelings aren't real. But again, in verse 1, the Lord is my light and my salvation, so why should I be afraid? The Lord is my fortress, protecting me from danger, so why should I tremble? Here's the question that I'd like to talk about today. We don't have people trying to kill us, hopefully, but we do face challenges. We do face opposition from people who, whatever, are kind of like against us or whatever. Like, we do have our own kinds of problems, right? So what can we learn? Here's the question. What can we learn from David in his attitude through the threats of life? In the threats of life, he had this attitude that helped him to weather the storm, helped him to address these threats, helped him to remain confident. There it is. It helped him to remain confident in the middle of the threats. What can we learn from David's life? Okay, I think there are a few clues, 3 actually, that I see in Psalm 27. And the first clue is in this word presence. God's presence, to be more specific. In verse 4, David says, remember, in verses 1 and 2, he's talking about people threatening and trying to kill him, But in verse 4, he says, the one thing I ask of the Lord, the thing I seek most, is to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, delighting in the Lord's perfections and meditating in his temple. Right? And I'm like, yeah, but David, don't you know that people are trying to kill you? And he's like, yeah, but the only thing I want is just to be in God's presence and, in his temple, right? In the middle of the threats, I think that part of the reason why David was able to keep his confidence is because he valued so much the presence of God. Now, in the Old Testament, God's presence is much different than what we experience today. In the Old Testament, God's presence was much more tangible, much more, tangible. In Exodus 40, verse 34, it says, like when Moses had finished building the tabernacle, which was like basically God's house, it was a spectacular tent that they made for God. And Moses had finished building the tabernacle. And it says in Exodus 40 that then the cloud covered the tabernacle and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. And whenever the cloud, like God's presence was literally in a cloud in the day, and at night a pillar of fire, right? There was like you could look and point at it and say, there is God, there is God's presence. At night, this pillar of fire, right? And when the cloud settled over the tent, then God's presence was there in the tent, right? And in the Old Testament, they had a much more tangible evidence of God's presence. And we see this in David's life years later. But David, there's a whole story around this, but David, they brought the Ark of the Covenant, which was a very, very sacred article, and God's presence was really in the Ark of the Covenant. And in 2 Samuel 6, when the Ark of the Covenant was brought into Jerusalem, David was so overjoyed that it says that David danced before the Lord with all his might, wearing a priestly garment. So David and all the people brought up the ark of the Lord with shouts of joy and the blowing of rams. And then in Psalm 63, this verse has always stood out to me. It says that David says, I have seen you in your sanctuary and gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. When David wrote this, he was not, speaking from a theoretical knowledge like, yeah, I've read in a book, kind of, No, I believe that David had been in the tabernacle. He had been in the tangible presence of God, maybe even with the cloud that had covered over it. He had been in the tangible presence of God. And again, he says in Psalm 63, I have seen you in your sanctuary, and I've gazed upon your power and glory. Your unfailing love is better than life itself. Hear those words? Your unfailing love is better than life itself. How I praise you. And now I go back. Now I understand why in verse 4 of Psalm 27, David says, the thing I ask the Lord, the thing I seek the most, right? Like if you could boil it all down to just one thing, the thing I seek the most is to live in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to live in God's presence, right? So we're asking the question, how did David have such great confidence when people were literally trying to kill him? One clue, I think, and I don't pretend to fully understand this, but one clue is that David had a very real, personal revelation of God's presence. And he wanted to live in God's presence. And friends, it's different for us today. There's not even a temple, there's no cloud, there's no tangible physical where we can say there is God, there is his presence. But friends, listen, in a very similar way, God is very real, and his presence through spiritual revelation is available to us. And that's not an intellectual thing, that's a spirit thing where we open our spirit to God and we say, God, please come and fill me with your presence, fill me with your spirit. And so I need to move along. But I think that, how do we have confidence in the middle of trials and problems? I think the first clue that David's giving us in verse 4 has something to do about a tangible sense of God's presence. The second clue in verse 11 is something that we talked about last week, and I'm just going to move over this quickly. But verse 11, teach me how to live, O Lord. Teach me, or the NIV says, teach me your way, O Lord. Lead me along the right path, for my enemies are waiting for me. David says, because my enemies are waiting for me, they're trying to trip me up, they're trying to, get me to fall into their trap. Because my enemies are waiting for me, God, would you please help me to live well? Would you please help me to make good choices that are not, listen, this is really important, making, kind of living in obedience to God does not guarantee that we will not have problems, right? It's not like a silver bullet, but somehow I think there's a principle here that when we learn to live God's way, when we learn to live in obedience to him, that somehow maybe it helps us to avoid pitfalls, or I think that's going to be an interesting conversation on Sunday. How does living a Jesus-centered, obedient life, it doesn't guarantee we won't have problems, but how does it help us to avoid some of the problems at least, okay? And my last thought, and I wanted to really get to this today, but my time is going quickly. My last thought is in verses 13 and 14, and the key word here is dependence. Dependence. Psalm 27:13. The New Living Translation says, "Yet I am confident that I will see the Lord's goodness while I am here in the land of the living. Wait patiently," and the word here is kava, "wait patiently for the Lord. Be brave and courageous. Yes, wait patiently for the Lord." The Amplified Version says, "Wait for and confidently expect the Lord." The Names of God says, "Wait with hope. Wait with hope for Yahweh." And then the New English Translation, it says, "Rely on the Lord. Be strong and confident. Rely on the Lord." This word kava that David used here, there's kind of a dual meaning to it. One half of it, or part of the meaning, is to wait eagerly, to hope, to expect. To wait eagerly, to hope, to expect. It's not just waiting, that hoping at some point the train is going to come and maybe the train, well, it's probably not a good example, but maybe it will happen, maybe it won't. No, this is like waiting with expectancy, right? It's not a passive waiting. It's a waiting with expectancy. But the second part of this word kava means to bind together like a twisted rope. And it's hard to really translate this into English, but I'm bound together with God like a twisted rope, and this is the dependence part. And as I'm bound together like a twisted rope with God, I'm depending on Him, I'm waiting for Him, I'm expecting Him to come. I am expecting Him to move in whatever situation, So think about a rope that has many, many different strands, and those strands are twisted together, and it's very, very strong, and it's very tight, it's very together, and it's very confident, right? This is the word that David uses. So when David says wait for the Lord, when he says to eagerly anticipate that God is going to come, then when we put that together with the challenges that David was facing, or with the challenges that we face, that sense of dependence, that sense of waiting on God, is a really significant piece to the answer to our question. Okay, so my time is up, but just kind of to summarize, we all have problems. Sure, nobody's trying to kill us. We don't live in a warrior culture, but we all have problems, and we don't have to deny the reality of our problems. We don't have to deny that our feelings are real in the middle of those problems, but still in the middle of those problems, we can have a sense of confidence, right? First, if we seek a true sense of God's presence by spiritual revelation. Second, if we do our best to live in obedience to the Jesus way. And three, if we have a sense of confidence, a sense of waiting, a sense of depending on God while we're walking through those challenges. And when you put those three things together, I think it gives us a bit of an idea why David can have the approach and the attitude that he had. Okay, my time is gone and I need to go. Hope we can see you on Sunday. And if not, I hope you have a fantastic day. God bless you, friends.